Okay, guys, we're going to finish up chapter 7 on the skeletal system. Begin by sharing the PowerPoint with you. We wrapped up intramembranous and endochondral ossification in the previous module. So we're picking up basically there on the section in chapter 7 entitled Homeostasis of Bone Tissue. Now, we've talked about the roles of both osteoblasts and osteoclasts in the process of making bone, but the role of those two cells don't end with those important ossification processes. The reality is that both of these cells continue to work in you and I as we speak, as bone is continually being remodeled all throughout our lives. So we're always breaking bony matrix down, and we're also building it up. And we'll give you some examples of when those processes take place. So when we talk about the role of those osteoclasts in cleaving or breaking down bone, that is referred to as resorption. The opposite of that is deposition, where calcium, for example, is banked into bony matrix thanks to the action of the osteoblasts. And those processes, as I said a moment ago, are taking place throughout our entire lives, not just when we lay down bone, but as adults, we're breaking bone down and we're building it up thanks to the action of those two cells. To the point at which 10 to 20% of our skeleton is really recycled or remodeled every year. That's really amazing. So basically, if you look at those statistics, every 5 to 10 years, you have a totally new skeleton. It's kind of weird when you stop and think about it. So let's focus next on some factors that impact growth and development and repair. We're going to talk about these 4 factors: nutrition, sun, hormones, and physical activity. So let's start off with nutrition, because certainly our nutrition has a lot of impacts on our health, not the least of which is healthy bone. So we're going to talk about a few deficiencies and the role they can play in affecting bone, starting with vitamin A. If you don't have enough vitamin A in your diet, it really impacts the ability of the body to build and break down bone. This process of recycling the bone, if you will, throughout our lives. Because those cells require vitamin A to function properly. So what do you do if you're dealing with a vitamin A deficiency? Where I've listed a few sources of vitamin A there that you can get. Of course, we can always take supplemental vitamin pills throughout our lives as well. A lot of people do that, but just eating healthy, balanced diets certainly can be important as well. So if you like liver and onions, you're getting adequate vitamin A. But most of the time, people are probably utilizing more dairy products there, butter and eggs and so forth, and getting plenty of vitamin A. Vitamin C, we associate with citrus, don't we? And it turns out that if you don't have enough vitamin C in your diet, this can lead to real problems with regard to collagen synthesis. Now remember, collagen or collagenous fibers are one of the 3 types of fibers that we talked about in one of the previous chapters on tissues. They help provide a lot of strength, don't they, to connective tissues. And certainly bone, in addition to having calcium in the matrix, also has lots of collagen as well, interwoven within the matrix. So that provides, again, strength to bone. And if you don't have adequate vitamin C in your diet, it turns out that the body is not able to produce or synthesize adequate collagen. And so the result is fragile and often slender bones. This is sometimes referred to as scurvy. Many centuries ago, when the British Empire was colonizing different parts of the world, they ran into this issue. The sailors often had scurvy, where the bones, again, were apt to fracture, and the individuals were not as healthy as they should be. And so one way that the British Navy got around the issue of deficiency in vitamin C on these long, years-long, voyages, or months-long voyages, is they would actually take limes, and they would somehow store them in these big oak barrels, and that's basically what the soldiers ate to overcome the issue of scurvy, which is where the term limeys come from. So somebody with scurvy or a deficiency in vitamin C in their diet would often have this bleeding near the gums or gingiva, as you can see in the photograph. Not very pleasant appearance there, but that's an indication of possible vitamin C deficiency. So by eating foods that are citrus, one can overcome this issue, but also notice tomatoes, good old leafy green vegetables are always a staple for lots of different vitamin deficiencies, but certainly having adequate green vegetables in the diet usually prevents this from happening in you and me. We don't see this very often in most developed world countries. Vitamin D. This is probably a vitamin that we associate with milk, right? And other dairy products. But it turns out that not having enough vitamin D in the diet really can cause issues, both in kids and in adults. And it turns out in children that don't have adequate vitamin D, their bones are very soft. They don't form normally. You get these deformities. As you can see in the sketch here, or the diagram, this child is suffering some bow-leggedness and some other issues with regard to the bones. They just don't form the way they should. And in the adult, you also have an issue referred to as osteomalacia. Again, this is in adults. Rickets is often associated with children. And the same general pattern often appears, where you get bow-leggedness in the lower torso, and other issues with regard to bones not functioning the way they should, or being softer than they should. And this again is due to not having enough vitamin D and not having enough calcium being absorbed in the small intestine and into the bloodstream. Okay, so vitamin D is necessary for the proper absorption of calcium. And remember, calcium is an important integral part of bony matrix. It provides the strength and rigidity in combination with collagen to give bone its structure. So we again often associate vitamin D with milk, but we can find it also in egg yolks, and if you like fish liver. Nobody, of course, usually eats this anymore, but cod liver oil used to be something that they used to give people, in the olden days, if you will, because it provided adequate vitamin D. But as it is indicated here, a lot of the foods that we eat don't have a lot of vitamin D in them, and so it's often added during the processing process. And a good example would be milk. Milk is fortified with vitamin D. It has it in it, but we often add additional vitamin D to the milk to provide adequate amounts for us to absorb adequate amounts of calcium. And it is not uncommon for most people to be vitamin D deficient, actually. I remember my PA telling me to take a vitamin D supplement each day, because studies have shown that a lot of people don't get enough vitamin D. I generally drink milk every day, so I probably have a higher intake than the average person, because a lot of people, I think, don't drink milk once they get into their teen years. At least I remember polling classes in the past and asking, how many of you guys drink milk still? And maybe a third of the hands go up. A lot of people sort of begin to wean themselves, if you will, literally, from vitamin D. or from milk, I should say, once they get to be teens. Okay, another factor that impacts bone formation and growth is sunlight. And we're going to be talking about a particular chemical called dehydrocholesterol. This is obtained often in the foods that we eat or by the cells of our digestive system. And when this chemical, the dehydrocholesterol, is carried to the surface of our skin and UV light strikes our skin, it actually converts this dehydrocholesterol into an inactive form of vitamin D. Now, we just finished up talking about vitamin D. Remember, in the previous slide, we said it was necessary for the absorption of what element? Calcium, right, calcium. So that inactive form of the vitamin D becomes activated when it's taken to the liver and the kidneys. So a little bit of light is not a bad thing in terms of its ability to convert this dehydrocholesterol into an inactive form of vitamin D, which is then activated again by the liver and the kidneys. So a little bit of sun, not a bad thing. Effects of hormones. One particular hormone that you'll be studying next semester when you take A&P2 is growth hormone, produced by a small gland that you've heard about that lies in the hypophyseal fossa of the sphenoid bone, and that is the pituitary gland. And so not having adequate amounts of growth hormone produced by the pituitary can lead to problems. We refer to it as pituitary dwarfism. And so obviously you see in the photographs individuals, dwarfs, that have delayed growth of typically the long bones. And this can be due, and often is due, to an inadequate amount of growth hormone being produced by the gland. And one of the more popular shows in the last 10 years, of course, is shown here in the lower left-hand corner and on the Learning Channel, of a family whose parents are dwarfs, and I think one of the one of the children here, the one son, is a dwarf, but the other 3 kids will be of normal stature. And this has been shown a lot of times to be due to genes that are inherited by the parents, whereby just by a luck of the draw, if you will, that if you're unfortunate enough, I guess, to acquire the gene, that leads to pituitary dwarfism, as is indicated by the one son. If the gene is not inherited, then the normal stature occurs. So a lot of work, as it mentions here, is being done in trying to identify that particular gene, and perhaps down the road one can either repair that, remove that gene, or adjust it in a particular way whereby the individual doesn't inherit that particular gene and get dwarfism. On the opposite end of the scale is what happens when too much growth hormone is secreted by the pituitary. And maybe you've heard of giantism before. And we'll talk about another disorder called acromegaly. So again, too much growth hormone produced by the pituitary can lead to giantism, like we see in this example of the world's tallest man, Robert Wadlow, who lived in the 30s and 40s, 1930s, 1940s. And I'm not going to play this YouTube video, but I would like you to watch it. It's a very, very interesting story of Robert Wadlow and some of the issues he had to deal with as the world's tallest man. Very interesting story. So this was something that impacted him from the time he was born. He had abundant amount of growth hormone as a kid. And that continued through his life. Sometimes what can happen, however, is you can have sort of normal growth and development into your early adolescent years. And then the pituitary, for whatever reason, doesn't stop or diminish its amount of growth hormone. There's no kind of regulation of that hormone, and it continues to be secreted in continuously high amounts throughout life. And that's what's occurring here in a disorder called acromegaly. So here we see a series of photographs of a woman, and you can kind of see as she gets older some of the phenotypic physical characteristics that begin to be quite noticeable that indicate overabundance of growth hormone. So there is basically thickening of the bone, not that it lengthens like you had with Robert Wadlow, but rather that it thickens. And so an individual with acromegaly would have the pronounced jaw here. The hands the fingers are very thick. And if you looked at the bones, you would see a much thicker femur and so forth. So this is referred to as acromegaly, and you can check out page 503 in the endocrine system chapter that talks more about both too much and not enough growth hormone. Very interesting. Okay, thyroxine, another hormone we want to talk a little bit about in addition to growth hormone. This is a hormone produced by the thyroid gland. And to orient you here, of course, we see an anterior view. Just to orient you, here's the trachea leading to the lungs. Here's the epiglottis. Here's the hyoid bone. This is your larynx, and the voice box would be sort of posterior to this. And just inferior to the larynx is our thyroid gland. And this is a really important hormone because it produces thyroxine, which has a real important role to play as that hyaline cartilage is replaced by bone in the process that we discussed earlier, endochondral ossification. So if you don't have adequate amounts of thyroxine produced to help stimulate that replacement of the hyaline cartilage with bone, then bones aren't going to develop and grow the way they're supposed to. So somebody, for example, that has an issue with their thyroid gland can be given synthetic hormone, Synthroid, I think it's called, to address this issue. So with today's knowledge, medical advancements, we can usually deal with this without too much difficulty, provided that it's diagnosed early enough. I'm going to just pause here for 1 second. Okay, I'm back. Okay, moving on to another group of hormones, the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogens. We often associate testosterone with the primary male sex hormone, and estrogen or estrogens, there's actually a group of estrogens, we associate those as the primary female sex hormone. But both of these do impact ossification of those epiphyseal growth plates during endochondral ossification. And note that it indicates on the slide that the estrogens have a more pronounced effect than those of testosterone. This helps to explain why, if you look at the ossification timetable that we did in the previous module, that in females, by the age of 23, almost all of their bones are fully ossified, while in males, that process occurs several years later. That's due again to the more pronounced influence of estrogens versus testosterone. Physical stress. This is not a stress as in mental stress, but physical exertion, if you will, the stress that's placed on a bone due to, for example, muscle contraction, because we know that many bones have structures on them where muscles attach. We talked about that in lab. So the stress one places on bones, i.e. via muscle contraction, pulling on the surface of the bone, because that's where the muscles attach to the bone, can help to stimulate bony growth. So remember me telling you in lab that sometimes you can look at bones like the femur or the humerus or what have you and see those thickenings where muscles attach. That can indicate that that individual used their muscles a lot. There was a lot of stress being placed on the bone via the contraction of the muscle. And that promotes actually good bony health. Oppositely, if you decrease the stress on the bone, as we mentioned here, like you put an arm in a cast because of the fracture, that can often lead not only to muscle weakness because you're not using the muscles, but it can also lead to bone resorption. In other words, the bone matrix can be diminished and become a little bit weaker as a result of that lack of stress being placed on the bone. So somebody, for example, that isn't very active can lead to decrease, bone mass. Okay, we're going to shift gears just a little bit here and talk about a process called hematopoiesis, not to be confused with homeostasis. Don't get those words mixed up. They're very, very different. Hematopoiesis, as it indicates, is the process that describes blood cell formation. Now, we won't be getting into the blood chapter for a while yet, but I do want to just make a brief mention because it does impact bone. We know today that in you and I, our red bone marrow is the site of red cell production, white cell production, and platelet production. But before your bones were present, right, where did that blood come from? Well, if you go back into early embryonic development in animals, you find that there's a structure referred to here as the yolk sac. So this is of an embryo that's but a mere several hours old, or maybe days old. And this yolk sac is that structure that initially produces blood cells. Isn't that interesting? And later, the liver and the spleen pick up that role as blood cell producers. Eventually, once the red bone marrow is manufactured, then of course, it is the primary source of our blood cells. So hematopoiesis begins even at early embryonic time, and then continues throughout life, of course. Well, we've been talking about the extracellular matrix quite a bit, indicating that it is both composed of collagen as well as calcium. And so those particular salts, of which calcium is the primary salt, are found in this structure referred to as calcium phosphate. So calcium phosphate is the primary source of calcium, or structure of calcium in the matrix. And we call this matrix that's mostly made up of calcium phosphate as hydroxyapatite, kind of a funny name, but that's the name of these groups of salts. So we want to talk next about the role that calcium can play in our bodies. Now we know again that it does contribute obviously to the formation of hydroxyapatite in the bony matrix, that it provides structure to the bone. But I also have mentioned in the past that calcium is also going to be important for other physiologic processes like muscle contraction, like blood clotting, as we'll learn about coming up in the next few chapters. So calcium is not restricted in terms of its role in providing strong, healthy bone. There are other reasons why having an adequate blood calcium level is critical. And so as we've talked about in the last couple weeks now, there are homeostatic mechanisms in place to prevent levels of things like calcium from getting too high or too low. When it gets too low, we bring it up. It gets too high, we bring it down, right? It's classic negative feedback loops. So let's talk a little bit about how your body regulates blood calcium levels. So here's the scenario. Our normal blood calcium level is shown here. What happens when it gets too high? How do we bring it down? Well, it's going to involve, as we've said before, the presence of receptors, a control center, and some effectors to do this. So the stimulus is an increase in blood calcium levels. Receptors in the thyroid gland pick up on this rise in blood calcium. That's what their role in life is to detect increases in blood calcium. So let's pretend that they do that. They will in turn cause the control center, also housed in the thyroid gland, to release a hormone called calcitonin. Okay, so here's an example of the receptors and the control center being in the same gland. Okay, earlier when we talked about thermoregulation, we had receptors in the skin, and we had the control center in the brain. It's not always the brain that's the control center. Here's an exception to the rule. So receptors pick up on the rise in blood calcium. They in turn cause other cells here in the thyroid gland to release calcitonin. That calcitonin is a hormone. It gets into the bloodstream. It's carried all throughout the body. The only cells that respond to increased calcitonin in our example here are osteoblasts, which are housed in the bone. And you know what osteoblasts do? They build bone. They're going to take that excess calcium and they're going to bank it in the form of calcium phosphate and hydroxyapatite. If you bank the calcium, you take it out of the blood and you put it in the matrix of the bone, what happens to your blood calcium level? Well, it falls, right? Okay. On the opposite end of the scale, what happens if your blood calcium level falls too low? How do we bring it up? Well, again, note the presence of receptors, a control center, and effectors. The receptors that pick up on this drop in blood calcium level are found in the parathyroid gland. Now, here's a diagram that shows those 4 parathyroid glands. There's actually 4 of them here, not just one. We're looking at the posterior surface here of the neck region. We've removed the muscles, of course, and the bones. And to orient you, this is the thyroid that we saw earlier, only this is a view from behind. Okay, this is the esophagus leading to the stomach. This is the trachea leading to the lungs. So those receptors in the parathyroid gland detect the drop in blood calcium. They in turn stimulate cells within the parathyroid glands to release a hormone called parathyroid hormone, or PTH for short. PTH is released into the bloodstream because this is an endocrine gland, just like the thyroid was an endocrine gland. So they endocrine glands release their hormones into the bloodstream. And this hormone, PTH, circulates throughout the entire body. Wherever the blood goes, it's being carried. However, only particular cells respond to that hormone. And those particular cells, those effectors, happen to be osteoclasts. And you remember osteoclasts cleave or break down bony matrix. When you break down bony matrix, you take the calcium out of the calcium phosphate and you put it in the blood as calcium ions. That's going to do what to the blood calcium levels? It's going to bring it up. So earlier we put calcium into the bank. Now we're taking calcium from the bank, from the matrix. We're liberating more calcium. Not to the point of weakening the bone substantially, but regular but rather just bringing up the blood calcium levels to adequate levels. So between the role of the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands, and the formation, of course, of and release of calcium and or PTH, we maintain a fairly constant level blood calcium. This is a very good question on the test, so you might want to spend some time looking at this. Fracture repair is something that you may have had firsthand experience with if you've ever broken a bone. So in your book in 210 and 211 in figure 7.1 of the clinical application box, they talk a little bit about fracture repair. And so let's describe that and discuss that. So let's pretend this is a long bone like the femur. You recognize, of course, the periosteum, the compact bone, spongy bone, yellow marrow in the medullary cavity. You know, this should look very familiar to you. So we have a fracture. The bone has been broken pretty substantially here. We also, of course, tear blood vessels that are found here in the medullary cavity. There also would be probably torn blood vessels in the periosteum as well. And of course, torn blood vessels in the compact bone too, right? Because we know that there are those blood vessels passing through the osteonic canals and the perforating canals that connect them, et cetera, et cetera. So fracturing a bone results in a lot of blood being released into that area, into this hematoma, it's called, or blood clot. So you form the hematoma or blood clot, and you have swelling, and you have pain, and you have basically an inflammatory reaction here, or response. One of the first things that happens as the bone begins to repair itself is the invasion of fibroblasts from the periosteum inward. And look what these fibroblasts are doing. They're beginning to produce fibrocartilage. Okay, so in this brown region here, well, actually, the light tan is really what's showing here. This is not initially bone, okay? This is fibrocartilage. They should have used a different color. In fact, in the latest edition of the whole book, they have a slightly different diagram there. But this is fibrocartilage that's beginning to form what's called a soft callus. Okay, so imagine a soft callus of fibrocartilage is produced by those fibroblasts. At the same time that the soft callus is being formed, the osteoclasts and the macrophages are phagocytizing any small little broken bits of bone and dissolving them, because there's probably going to be some shards of bone in there due to the fracture. And might be bacteria as well. If it was a compound fracture, there could have been bacteria introduced from the air or from the injury, whatever it might have been. And so, you know, the white cells are going to try to mop up those potential infectious microorganisms like bacteria that could have been introduced into the wound. Note also, in addition to the fibrocartilaginous callus being formed, is we also have new blood vessels that are beginning to be made here. Angiogenesis is occurring. Soon, we're going to see a bony callus replace that soft fibrocartilaginous callus. And in order to make a bony callus, we're going to be calling upon our friends, the osteoblasts, to build that bone. Initially, it's spongy bone that's laid down. Again, those coming in from the periosteum, which is also being reformed here as well, by the way. So having a good, adequate blood supply is super critical in helping any wound heal quickly. The more blood, the better to get in there, deliver those osteoclasts, deliver those macrophages, and begin to reestablish nutrient flow to the tissue, right? So after several weeks or months, that bony callus has really fully replaced the fibrocartilage in the same way that bone replaced hyaline cartilage in endochondral ossification. Okay, so this is not replacement of hyaline cartilage. This is replacement of fibrocartilage, but the mechanism is very, very similar. So again, we can see we've reestablished the blood supply. We are now beginning to replace the fibrocartilage with bone, thanks to osteoblasts coming in. And then we've got to begin to hollow out that medullary cavity. And of course, osteoclasts are going to help do that. They're going to cleave the spongy bone that was here. Okay, so take that spongy bone away, reestablish the medullary cavity, lay down, again, compact exterior to the endosteum, which is this thin membrane, remember, that lines the medullary cavity. And note, again, a little bit of spongy bone just under the endosteum. And of course, a lot of compact. And then, of course, our fibrous vascular periosteum on the very outer surface of the bone. So we have completely replaced that fracture. And in many instances, that particular fracture site is so strengthened that a fracture at that same site, a refracture, is almost, I won't say impossible, but it's very unlikely. So the body sort of compensates in the repair process to further strengthen that area that was fractured. So sometimes you can actually see where a fracture occurred, say in a skeleton, where a humerus was broken. You can see where somebody almost like spot welded it. It's kind of weird. There's a rib that I should show you from the container we have in lab, where there was a fracture of the rib, and there's like a elevated area of bone right where that rib fracture was. You can definitely tell that the body repaired that fracture and strengthened that particular area. It's very noticeable. Here's a YouTube video that I'd like you to watch that sort of reviews a lot of the things we've been talking about with respect to ossification and remodeling a bone and so forth. So check it out. Do know what osteoporosis is as well. I won't really lecture on that, but you should be familiar with what that is. I'm sure you can go into the back of the whole book and look up osteoporosis and get more information about that. It's probably discussed, well, actually it's discussed a little bit there on page 213. They talk a little bit about this in the clinical application box, preventing fragility fractures. But this video will also talk a little bit about that as well. I would like you also to know the difference between the axial and appendicular skeletons. And this is described in lab. I think this is the very same diagram that I've used in lab, where we have, again, the bones in orange, comprising the axial skeleton, which is pretty much down the center, longitudinal center of the body, with the appendicular bones shown here in yellow. Just again, think of the word appendicular or appendage. Okay. And so you should be familiar with the general bones as shown on this diagram. We will not be talking about subsequent diagrams in chapter 7. I would certainly have your book with you when we do these in lab, just to have as a reference, but I'm not going to be testing you on structures of specific bones. Again, that's really reserved for lab. But if you do encounter any clinical application or from science to technology boxes, you should definitely take a look at those. And as I'm leafing through the chapter, I see there is a clinical application box that talks about disorders of the vertebral column. So definitely take a moment and check that out. that might be the only other remaining box to check out in chapter 7. Okay, so that finishes up chapter 7. And we'll put this on Blackboard for you to access.